Hello and welcome back for our history lesson 3, the Delhi Sultans. We begin with part 2 today. I hope you have revised whatever we have covered in our first session. So just a quick recap. So in the first session, we just discussed that how and when did Delhi gain importance or Delhi became an important place. Then we discussed how the Tomar Rajputs were defeated by Prithviraj Chauhan. Then we discussed about a short story of Prithviraj Chauhan and Muhammad Ghori. And then finally, how this Sultanate period started with the early Turkish rulers, or which we call as the slave dynasty. So we also discussed that there were 5 important ruling dynasties during the Sultanate period, which are as follows. So we have the slave dynasty, followed by Khalji dynasty or the Khiljis. Then we have the Tughlaq dynasty, Sayyid dynasty, and the Lodi dynasty. And then we discussed a few things about the rulers of those dynasties. So now let's see, how do we know about the Delhi Sultans? What are the sources of information which tell us about the Sultanate period? So the sources of information include inscriptions. As always, these inscriptions, manuscripts, or any other written document proves to be a valuable source of information to tell us about our past. Then the coins, yes, because the coins tell us about the time period of a particular dynasty or of a particular king who ruled the subcontinent or a specific area. So it is also important. And yes, finally, the architecture. The different kind of architecture that is present in a subcontinent tells us more about the past, and it also tells us how important were the construction of different temples or forts or palaces for the kings or the rulers. Now, one more important thing that gives us a lot of information about the Sultanate period is the Tariq, which is a singular word, and Tawarik, that is plural. So these are certain written historical records which are written event wise and date wise. So these give a lot of information about the time during the Sultanate period. And these tawarikhs were generally written in the Persian language, as Persian was the language of administration for the sultans. Now, who wrote the tawarikhs? Who were the people who noted down what is important, and then the tawarikhs were maintained? So these were the learned men in the court, that means the secretaries or the administrators, the poets or the courtiers of the ruler. They also kept a check on the events. So it's like, as I mentioned, they kept a note of events that took place in the dynasty or in the kingdom or in that area. And the other job that they did was they also gave advice to the rulers on governance and just rule. That means how they should administrate their kingdom was also suggested by the Tawariks, as they were the learned people, and also they explained the rulers the importance of just rule. So here just rule means by giving right decision and justice to the people. Then these people who wrote Tawarikhs, they mainly resided in the city, that is, they were the residents of Delhi. Very rarely these people would live in villages. They also wrote records to please the rulers and get rewards. So sometimes they also wrote some things which would please the ruler to get rewards. They also advised the rulers to preserve an ideal social order based on birthright and gender distinction. So they used to always suggest the rulers, advise them from time to time that you should preserve the social order. Whatever the society is following since years together, you also need to stick to those ideas. And what was those? Birthright. What is birthright? The privileges claimed on account of birth. There are certain privileges that you get during your birth. So these rulers had to preserve this birthright. That means while they take in the courtiers or they want to appoint certain ministers and all, they should check from which particular background those people are there, and they need to preserve it. So, for example, people believed that nobles inherited their rights to govern because they were born in certain families. So, if a person is born in a noble family or in the family of those ministers or as a kshatriya, these people by birth get a privilege to govern certain areas, and so that privilege should be given to them. And also they should focus on gender distinction. Our society follows gender distinction, and it was following. What is gender distinction now? Social and biological differences between women and men. Usually these differences are used to argue that men are superior to women. And in our ancient time period, we know that it was a male dominated society. And here also, these learned people told the ruler to maintain the same. It should not be that the men should be treated inferior to a woman. No, never. So men should always be at a high position, and women were rarely included in the administrative parts. So here is the definition again. So birthright means privileges claimed on account of birth, certain rights, certain privileges that you get by birth. Then we have gender distinctions, whereas social and biological differences between women and men, usually used to argue that men are superior to women. Then let's take a look at the picture and try to guess what it is. Can you see a man working with a kind of a stamping material? It's having a white base with a stick kind of a thing in his hand. He's trying to press something, if you can check. Yes. So he is actually preparing the paper for writing this event. So in those days, paper was recently invented, and so people had to make it in their kingdoms. So he is making the paper, maybe using the wood pulp. Then this is another picture, and we can see that person is writing something. So once the paper was ready, the scribes were appointed to write the text or the records on paper. Then the next picture here is, we can see the man who is melting the gold to highlight important words and passages. So in the earlier times when these manuscripts were written or certain books were made, people used the liquefied gold to highlight certain important names, certain important events, and that is what this man is doing. Then we have the last picture wherein we can see this man is actually binding all the pages together to prepare a book kind of a thing. And what was this? All these four pictures tell us that this is a process of making the manuscripts. Earlier, this was the method followed to make a manuscript. Then let's talk about Kutubuddin Aibak. Here is a picture for your reference. So who was Kutubuddin Aibak? This Kutubuddin Aibak was a trustworthy minister of Muhammad Ghori and also the founder of slave dynasty. So he was the early Turkish ruler. He was the founder of this particular dynasty, which is an important dynasty of the Sultanate period. So it's so said that after Ghori's death, Qutbuddin Aibak captured all his territories in the subcontinent, and then he started ruling Delhi, and he was the founder of the slave dynasty. He is also the person who started the construction of the Qutub Minar. Then we have one more person whose name is Samshuddin Iltutmish. So he was also one of the slave, but he was the slave of Kutubuddin Aibak. Kutubuddin Aibak had purchased him as a slave, and then later Samshuddin Iltutmish succeeded Kutubuddin Aibak. That means he became the ruler. Now Iltutmish was a ruler who thought about equality, and he treated people equally as well. We come to know this by the next example that I give you. So here it is, and she is Razia Sultan, the Empress of Delhi, the first Muslim empress to be crowned as an empress or a sultan in Delhi. So she is Razia. So who was Razia? She was the daughter of Samshuddin Iltutmish, and she was crowned as a sultan during the days when women were not valued. She succeeded her half brother Ruknuddin Firoz. So it's so said that Iltutmish thought that all his sons were not so capable and did not have the qualities of becoming a ruler, and so it was his wish that she should be made the empress. And finally, she could succeed Ruknuddin Firoz, who was crowned as a ruler after Samshuddin Iltutmish. But he could not rule in a correct way, so Razia took up the charge. Then it's also said that some of the chroniclers and nobles during that time period did not like a woman to be a sultan or a ruler. And so Minaj-e-Siraj, the 13th century chronicler, says Razia being crowned is against the decision of God, as women are meant to be fragile and delicate and not to take weapons. So they should always be subordinate to men. But then he also says that she was more able and qualified than her brothers. So he gives both the statements in her favor as well as against her. He says that God has made women to be subordinate, inferior to men, whereas this lady is taking weapons. She is ruling the entire kingdom, which is against the decision of God. So then the nobles in her court, or the ministers, they hated her and felt that taking orders from a woman was not correct during those days, as they followed the male dominated society. She was later defeated by her half brother Muizuddin Behram, along with the 40 nobles of her court, who were known as Chahalganis, in a battle where she was killed in a planned conspiracy. So her rule lasted only for a span of 4 years. And after Razia was killed, after a few years, one of the nobles in her court became the ruler. And who was he? He was Ghiazuddin Balban. But it took almost 25 to 26 years for Ghiazuddin Balban to succeed the throne, because there were Razia's brother who were having constant fight for the rule. So this is all from my side for today. If any doubts, any queries, as usual, please note it down. We would discuss it during our session. Till then, bye. Take care of yourselves. Be healthy. Be inside.